Welcome to Fishing Tutorials. Today's episode is about how to catch barbel. Barbel are an awesome species. They grow pretty big, fight very hard, and live in some of the most incredible waterways. In this video, we are going to cover the main topics related to barbel fishing. So that's location, baits, tactics, and tackle. So let's get started with location. Firstly, it's important to note that barbel are actually only native to a handful of eastern flowing rivers in the UK. When barbel are present in southern or western flowing rivers, they are in fact stocked. In some cases, these stockings have actually been illegal. In other cases, they've been organised by the Environment Agency and fishing clubs to spread barbel around the UK, as they are a prize fish to target. Two famous rivers where barbel are plentiful, and indeed they were initially stocked by anglers, is the River Wye and also the River Severn. There actually would have never been barbel in those rivers, but people have introduced them and they have thrived since then. There are a small number of rivers in the very north and very south of the UK that contain barbel. However, when you venture up into Scotland, they are incredibly rare. Barbel are also present across a lot of Europe, and you tend to find them in faster flowing, well oxygenated, powerful rivers. Barbel are less prominent when the water is deep and slow, but you can find them in those sorts of places on occasions. But the places that you want to look out for prime barbel habitat are fast flowing, powerful rivers with plenty of oxygen in them. If you are unsure about the populations of barbel in rivers local to you, definitely go into your nearby tackle shop and ask questions in there. Failing that, check online catch reports, go on forums and stuff like that. Do a little bit of research, and that will save you wasting time fishing a river that doesn't even have any barbel in it. So once you've chosen a river to fish and you're fairly confident there are barbel present, you'll then need to look at specific locations along that river where you're more likely to find them. Alex and I personally have found most numbers of barbel in areas of powerful flow, well oxygenated water, and areas where there's quite a lot of structure and places for them to hide. So our best advice would be go and find a weir pool. Weir pools are probably the #1 guaranteed area of a river to find barbel in. The tumbling water, the oxygenated area definitely provides the perfect habitat for barbel, so check out weirs, but don't also ignore gravel runs which have got weed on them. Up on the River Wye, if you find a lovely fast flowing gravel run with loads of weed growth, that is a prime area for barbel. It's also worth looking in areas where there are rafts on the surface, fallen trees, tree roots in the water, lots of snags and structure where barbel are likely to feel safe. Those are the sorts of places that you're likely to find your barbel. Before fishing, check what seasons apply in your area. In England and Wales, the river season for coarse fish is between June 16th and March 14th inclusive. Within the river season, we tend to find the best time of year to catch barbel is in the summer if there's a flood, or in late autumn, early winter, when you get a little bit of rain in conjunction with some mild weather. To summarise, the ideal barbel conditions are when the river is slightly coloured, you've had a little bit of rain, and the weather is mild. The combination of those two factors mean that barbel are probably going to be on the feed. Times when barbel fishing is slightly more difficult is when the river's very clear or the water is very cold. In those cases, it might be a little bit more difficult. One bit of advice when the water is flowing clear is to try and be on the water at dawn or dusk. Middle of the day when the water's crystal clear can be very hard to catch barbel. They're quite light sensitive, and when those light levels begin to drop, or in the very early morning when it's still, not so bright, those are ideal times to catch yourself a barbel. The next topic to look at is bait. We've actually found barbel to not be too picky when it comes to bait. We've caught them on maggots, casters, worms, boilies, pellets, bread and spam. So there's a real selection of baits there that we've caught barbel on, and they will happily eat any of those. Smaller baits like casters, maggots and hemp seed are great when float fishing or when barbel fishing in clear water. Fish meal ground baits can also score well, especially when mixed in with a few small pellets. If you mix your ground bait quite stodgy with quite a lot of water, you can cram that into a feeder or ball it up into balls, ensuring that it reaches the bottom and deposits the bait down there. We've found fishing with really dry ground bait not to be so good for barbel fishing because the feeder or ball can hit the surface and just disperse straight away, creating a big cloud of bait but not really getting it down on the bottom. Larger and smellier baits like worms, boilies, pellets and spam tend to work best when ledgering on the bottom, particularly if the water is murky. When the water is very muddy and stirred up, we'd definitely advise using spam, as we found that to be one of the best floodwater baits, mostly just because it smells stronger than anything else and the barbel can find it in the murky water. The other benefit of fishing with pellets, boilies, spam or worms is you tend to get less bother from smaller fish like minnows or little roach. Whilst on the topic of bait, one thing we would definitely advise is to try and put some bait into a swim before you fish it. Reason being is that barbel can be very wary. If you just chuck a lead in or a feeder straight on their heads, they can spook out and not come back for a while. However, if you arrive at the river and introduce bait to say 4 or 5 different swims, leave them alone for a little while and then fish them throughout the day, those fish have had time to get confident, start feeding on your bait and be less spooky when you actually turn up and cast your rig in. Try baiting your swims with wetted pellet and a bit of hemp seed. The wetted down pellet goes quite tacky, means you can squeeze it into little balls which will hold together until it reaches the bottom. In very fast or deep water, it's probably best not to just throw bait out because you can't be certain how long it's going to take before it reaches the bottom and whether or not that bait is actually settling where you think it is. In this situation, I'd actually advise you use a bait dropper. A bait dropper is a baiting device, a bit like a spod or a spom, but the difference is it's got a lid. You open that lid up, fill it with bait, attach it to your rod, cast it in, and as it sinks down to the bottom it stays shut, it hits the deck, the lid opens and the bait is deposited exactly where you want it on the bottom. You can use a bait dropper with maggots, casters, pellets, hemp, pretty much anything. It's especially useful when you want to deposit small baits right down on the bottom in fast or deep water. Using a bait dropper avoids any wasted bait and makes sure it all gets to the bottom in the spot which you want it to. Barbel fishing tactics. We have fished for barbel loads over the years and use a lot of different methods to catch them. However, there's a few specific tactics that we'd like to share with you today and show you the rigs and how to use them. We tend to break our barbel fishing up into 3 main categories. Number 1, rolling baits. Number 2, ledgering. And number 3, feeder fishing. Of course there is also float fishing, and although we have caught barbel on the float, it tends to be less productive and also less selective than fishing on the bottom. So we'll stick with the first few methods. When coming to a new river and fishing it for the first time, you'll often want to fish as many swims as possible and cover as much area as possible to search out where those barbel might live. We like to take a fairly large hook, tie it onto our line, squeeze on a shot or 2, and that is our starting rig. It might look too simple, but this setup has produced us so many fish over the years, it's mad. Attaching your bait with worms is easy, just hook them on. With spam though, I'd suggest using a gate latch baiting needle to pull your hook through the bait, turn it a little bit, and then hook it back in. This keeps the bait on for longer and hides the hook from a fish when it takes your bait. You will need to strike the rod quite firmly though, to ensure the hook is pulled out of the bait and into the fish. One last point on this topic is when you need to cast further, or if your spam is quite soft, you can pull the hook through the bait with a baiting needle and then tuck a little twig or folded over bit of grass under the hook before pulling it back through. We found this not really to affect the number of bites, but it definitely helps keep the bait on better. The number of shot that you pinch on the line is dependent on the depth of the water and the flow. An ideal amount of shot will mean that your bait gets to the bottom and roughly just about stays there until you flick the rod a little bit or tighten the line and it will dislodge and bump further down. In different swims and different speeds of water, you'll have to experiment with different numbers of split shot. When doing this style of fishing and rolling baits through your swim, it's easiest and often best to cast upstream and then let the bait slowly drift back down towards you. Wading out into the water can also be helpful to enable you to get better presentation on the bait. Ideally, you'll leave the bait still on the bottom for a little bit before twitching it back towards you and then leaving it there a little bit longer. You keep doing that, repeating the process leaving it still, twitching it back, until you've come right in and you're at your feet, and then you can make another cast. When rolling baits, a bite is often signalled by a little pluck on the rod tip. On occasions though, the line can fall completely slack, and in those cases you need to quickly reel up that slack and feel whether or not there's a fish there. As soon as you feel confident little movement on the end, reel down and set that hook, and you should have the fish. Sometimes it's not possible to fish upstream, and in fact on some rivers you may find that just downstream from where you are there's an overhanging tree or a raft that you want to fish down to. In those cases, take a few split shot off, try not to use too much weight, flick it down there and aim to get the bait to get carried by the flow down and underneath the branches or into the home of the barbel. Sometimes you can just pay off lines slowly and enable your bait to get closer to the fish. Other times you'll need to get the line in the current and then just flick the rod tip to try and dislodge the bait and edge it down towards where you think those fish might be. I do find though that fishing upstream is definitely more effective. It gives you better presentation of the bait and also enables you to cover more water throughout the day. But try a little bit of both and see what works for you. Next up is ledgering or feeder fishing. When you want to fish with a static bait anchored on the bottom, the best way to do this is with a feeder or a ledger, especially when combined with a hair rig as opposed to hooking the bait directly on the hook. The reason we like to use hair rigs for barbel when ledger fishing is down to the way that barbel and chub feed differently. Now firstly, I'll just explain that catching chub from a barbel swim is quite likely to spook those barbel and make you less likely to catch them. So one of the aims when targeting barbel is actually to avoid catching chub. One of the ways that you can avoid catching chub and catch more barbel is by using the hair rig. Chub will often feed by grabbing a bait in their lips and then turning or pecking at a bait, whereas barbel feed more like hoovers, just sucking the bait up into their mouth. Basically means that if you use a hair rig, you're less likely to catch chub, but more likely to get barbel. Now I'm not saying that you won't catch chub on hair rig, you do get the odd one, but I definitely advise using hair rigs when specifically trying to single out barbel. If you're fishing somewhere which has got loads of chub and a very small number of barbel and you really don't want to catch any more chub, I would advise just using a slightly longer hair rig. The longer you go, the less likely you are to catch those chub. Using a hair rig also lessens the importance of a perfectly timed strike. Because that hook is always exposed, it's more likely to get caught in the fish's mouth and it tends to end up with more confident wrap-round bites as opposed to little taps that you've got to strike at just the right time. So now let's take a look at a couple of simple ledgering barbel rigs and the pros and cons of each one. On one hand, you've got the lead clip setup, which enables you to change the size of your lead or feeder throughout your session. And on the other hand, there's just a simple running rig setup, which potentially gives a more free running setup and maybe a little bit more finesse. Should you choose to fish with a lead clip, these are the items that you will need. A Guru micro lead clip. This comes with the tail rubbers and micro swivels. Your feeder or lead of choice, some 8 or 10 pound line. In clear water we would advise fluorocarbon as it's more transparent, a strong size 12 hook and boilie stops. You'll also need some scissors and a baiting needle. Now let's tie the rig. Starting with the main line, we like to use 10 or 12 pound monofilament as barbel fight very hard. Remember to use a hook link of a slightly lighter breaking strain than your main line, that way if you get snagged you end up losing just your hook, not your feeder or lead. Take the end of your main line and thread it through the tail rubber, and then through the lead clip. Now tie your line onto a micro swivel. We tend to use a half blood knot, but a Palomar or uni knot will work fine too. Wet your knot before pulling it tight and then trim the tag end. The tail rubber, lead clip and swivel will pull down to look like this. Now it's time to tie a hook link. For barbel fishing we'll use a hook link of anything between 1 to 4 or 5 feet. If the water's quite murky and the fish are feeding confidently, then we'll go quite short. If it's very clear water and the fish are wary, then we'll go longer. The aim of a longer hook link is simply to separate your bait from your lead setup, meaning the fish is less likely to spook off your lead or your main line. Peeling off a length of hook link material and cutting it off, you then need to tie a small overhand loop in the end. This loop will hold your bait of choice. Then thread on your hook and set the hair length. Wrap the line around the shank of the hook, knotless knot style, wrapping approximately 7 times before passing the line back through the hook eye towards the point. Tighten this down and your rig is nearly done. Now tie the other end of your hook link to the micro swivel with a blood, Palomar or uni knot. Now you can mount your hook bait. In this case, a trimmed down piece of pepperami, a great firm bait that will withstand small fish pecking at it and works really well for barbel. Next, pop in a boilie stop to hold the bait in place. The rig is finished by attaching a lead or feeder to the lead clip. We like to use this setup with a lead clip most of the time when we're fishing on larger rivers. Reason being is that we can start the day using a large feeder or something to introduce a bit of bait, get some bait in the swim, and then later on, if we've put enough bait in the water, we can actually take that feeder off and switch to a smaller lead, which makes less of a splash when you make the cast. Many anglers will use this setup on 2 rods and fish them at the same time, often fishing with the upstream rod on a feeder and the downstream one on a straight lead. The lead makes less of a splash, but the feeder introduces bait, drawing fish up into the swim. Very regularly, the fish will come into the swim early on and feed where that bait is, but if you catch a few and they back off, they may end up further down the swim, and that's where you can use the small lead and use that downstream rod just to cast around and explore to find out where those fish might be. This rig is a good way though to fish both methods and change throughout the day. If you'd prefer not to use a lead clip, there's another setup which creates a neat little free running rig, and that's what we'll show you how to tie now. For this, you'll need the same items as the lead clip setup, but switch the lead clip, tail rubber and micro swivel for a Guru speed bead. Take your lead or feeder of choice and thread it onto your main line. Detach the 2 parts of the speed bead, thread the bead up onto the main line and tie on the swivel. We use a half blood knot, but as before mentioned, other knots will work fine. Now just like before, you'll tie a hook link, but at the end of the hook link you will need to tie a figure of 8 loop knot. This loop at the end of your hook link will pass over the speed bead swivel before the bead is pushed down and tucks over it. Although with this setup you can't change your lead without cutting the main line and retying, one thing you can do with this setup is change hook links very quickly and easily. By detaching the speed bead, you can loop on or off any of the hook links that you've prepared for your day of fishing and change them quite quick. So that is 2 different barbel fishing rigs tied up, and it's just a matter of personal preference which one you want to use in your fishing. Before we move on, I would like to look at hook and bait arrangement. As you saw, I tied a hair rig, which works great with pepperami as we used, or small pellets and boilies and stuff. However, for convenience, when using spam or something very soft as a hook bait, we actually like to swap out the traditional hair rig for a setup with a speed stop instead. This is because a standard boilie stop often falls off when using a soft bait like spam. However, by tying a speed stop on the hair instead of a loop, you can mount a piece of meat quickly like this, and when the bait comes off, the stop is still there, so less wastage. So that's a couple of ledger or feeder fishing rigs that you can use for your barbel fishing. When fishing with a ledger or feeder in a flooded river, or in a very powerful one where you're casting quite far out, it can be very beneficial to put your tips quite high up. You'll often see barbel fishermen on tidal rivers or fishing in big weir pools where there's a lot of flow, fishing with their rod tips right up in the air. And that's not just for show, that is to keep as much line out the water as possible. The reason you want to keep that line out the water is because the more line beneath the surface, the more likely your weight is to be dragged by the flow and moved out of position. If your ledger is bouncing around on the bottom or dragging through the swim, you're probably going to get snagged, and it's quite possible that you won't catch any fish. Instead, you want your baits to stay in position and not budge. So by positioning the rod tips up high and slackening off a little bit of line so you have a bow, those weights are much more likely to stay in place until you get a bite. When you're fishing with your rod tips up high like this, bites from barbel are normally confident wraparounds and you know there's a fish on the end. However, do watch your rod tips carefully because sometimes the tip can just tap a few times and you've actually got a chub hanging on the end that you've got to reel in. If the river that you're fishing is very flooded and you can't hold bottom with your lead in the normal positions, we'd actually advise you try and find a slack area. So by this I mean look for an area where there might be a fallen tree or a bend in the river where the water becomes slower. In times of flood and high water, fish will often gravitate towards those areas where they don't have to swim so hard against the flow. It's also got the added advantage that you'll be much more likely to hold bottom with your leads in a slack area like this. So the fish will be there, you'll be able to present a bait better there. We definitely advise looking for slack areas of the river when the river is in flood. When fishing coloured or flooded rivers, a great way to catch barbel can be with one of the rigs that we've shown you already, but as a lead, use a gripper lead. Gripper style leads tend to be covered in lumps and bumps and sometimes have a hole in the middle. This style of lead is great because it holds the bottom much better than a conventional style lead. The other benefit of a lead like this is that you can wet down some halibut pellets. Just pour some hot water on a little tub of halibut pellets, leave it for a little while and then ball it up into a sort of paste. If you've got the correct amount of water, those pellets will go quite tacky and sticky. You can then wrap those pellets around the gripper lead and that ensures that you've got scent and attraction leaking out down the river right near where you're fishing. Lastly, let's take a look at the tackle that we would advise for barbel fishing. There are a few essentials that we'll cover first. A sufficient size landing net. Some people will use a specimen carp net like this triangular variety, but in fast flows this net can become hard to maneuver, so an alternative is a solid framed net like this. An unhooking mat. Any mat of 70 centimeters or more should do the trick and keep your fish from hurting itself. We wouldn't advise the use of a keep net or a carp sack for retaining barbel. Instead, just get them in the net, rest them for a little bit, take your photos and get them straight back in the water. The reason we don't advise retaining them for long periods of time in a carp sack or keep net is that they don't tend to fare so well. Unlike carp, which are really hardy, barbel can go belly up if you don't keep them in oxygenated water and get them back quite quickly. Now for your rod and reel setup. A good option is to get a quiver tip or Avon style rod. Some people will just use carp rods for barbel fishing, which of course does work, but bite indication doesn't tend to be so good. Those carp rods which have got very stiff blanks won't show bites from chub so well, so you might not be fishing as effectively as you could be with a quiver tip or Avon style rod. I personally use a through action quiver tip rod on smaller rivers and a 1.5 pound test curve Avon rod when fishing larger weights and bigger rivers. In flood conditions, when you have to fish with really big leads or massive feeders, then you can probably get away with carp rods. Most people will barbel fish with a fixed spool reel or bait runner setup. Alex and I are happy to use any fixed spool reel with a decent drag. The only important thing is that you fill it up with quite strong line as barbel fight very hard and use a reel which has got a decent clutch or drag system. If you're confident with bait runner, then that's brilliant, but if you're not and you play fish off the drag, make sure your reel gives drag smoothly because barbel can fight really hard under the rod tip. Lots of times we've brought barbel in, they've come in, then whilst they're right in front of us just by the net, they will power off very quickly and you've got to have your drag set ready for that. To complete your barbel fishing setup, a lightweight rucksack, a bait bucket and a lightweight bank stick with a rod rest attached is pretty much everything you'll need. So that is our introduction to barbel fishing. If you love your river fishing and barbel in particular, definitely go check out these two videos that have just shown up here on my left. We hope you enjoy watching them and we'll see you guys soon.